Royal Guard story. First part, the morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac of Heathrow Airport as Flight BA447 prepared for what should have been a routine journey to Dubai. Captain James Morrison adjusted his tie and walked through the terminal, his crisp uniform drawing respectful nods from passengers and crew alike. At 52, he had been flying commercial aircraft for nearly 3 decades, but today felt different somehow. There was an electricity in the air that he couldn't quite explain. Meanwhile, in the VIP departure lounge, Prince Alexander sat quietly reading diplomatic briefings, occasionally glancing at his watch. The 28-year-old prince was known for his punctuality and attention to detail, traits that had served him well in his role as a junior member of the royal family. His security detail, led by Chief Inspector Sarah Wells, maintained their positions around the lounge with practiced invisibility. Among the security team was Royal Guard Marcus Thompson, a decorated veteran who had served the royal family for 8 years without incident. Marcus had earned his position through exceptional service in the military and had never once failed in his duties. However, the past week had been particularly challenging for him. His newborn daughter had been keeping him awake most nights, and his wife was struggling with postpartum complications that required his constant attention when he was off duty. As the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Prince Alexander gathered his belongings and moved toward the gate with his entourage. The flight was scheduled to depart at 2:30 p.m., and everything was proceeding according to plan. Marcus took his assigned position in row 12, strategically placed to have a clear view of the prince while maintaining the discreet presence that royal protection required. The aircraft was a Boeing 777-300ER, one of British Airways' flagship long-haul aircraft. Captain Morrison completed his pre-flight checks with his co-pilot, First Officer David Chen, a capable pilot with 12 years of experience. The weather conditions were favorable, and air traffic control had cleared them for an on-time departure. The 384 passengers aboard included business travelers, tourists, and several diplomatic personnel accompanying the prince on his trade mission. As passengers settled into their seats, Marcus felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settling over his shoulders. He had managed only 3 hours of sleep the previous night after rushing his wife to the hospital for what turned out to be a false alarm. The relief he felt when the doctors assured them everything was fine had been overwhelming, but it had left him emotionally and physically drained. The aircraft pushed back from the gate precisely on schedule, and Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom with the standard safety announcement and flight information. The prince occupied seat 3A in first class, reading through documents while occasionally making notes in the margins. His personal secretary, Jennifer Hayes, sat across the aisle organizing the prince's schedule for the upcoming week in Dubai. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Marcus found himself fighting to keep his eyes open. The gentle vibration of the aircraft and the warm afternoon sun streaming through the window created the perfect conditions for drowsiness. He had been in similar situations before and had always managed to stay alert through sheer willpower and professional discipline. Today, however, his body was betraying him. The takeoff was smooth and uneventful. Captain Morrison guided the aircraft into a steady climb, and the familiar sounds of the engines settling into cruise mode filled the cabin. Flight attendants began their service, and most passengers relaxed into their seats for the 7-hour journey ahead. Marcus attempted to maintain his vigilant watch, but his eyelids grew increasingly heavy. First Officer Chen noticed nothing unusual as they reached their cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. The autopilot was engaged, and all systems were functioning perfectly. The flight path would take them over France, Switzerland, Austria, and into Middle Eastern airspace before their final approach to Dubai International Airport. Weather reports along the route were favorable, with only minor turbulence expected over the Alps. In the cabin, Prince Alexander had moved on to reviewing architectural plans for a cultural center that would be announced during his visit to Dubai. The project represented a significant investment in cross-cultural understanding and would cement important diplomatic relationships between Britain and the UAE. His concentration on the documents was absolute, as was his custom when dealing with matters of state. Marcus's head began to nod despite his best efforts to remain alert. The combination of sleep deprivation, emotional stress, and the soporific effects of the pressurized cabin were proving too much to overcome. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but it had not accounted for the simple human need for rest after days of worry and sleepless nights. The other members of the security team were positioned throughout the aircraft, according to established protocols. Chief Inspector Wells sat in row 8, maintaining communication with ground control and monitoring passenger behavior. 2 additional officers were stationed at the front and rear of the aircraft, creating a protective perimeter around the prince without drawing attention to his presence. As the flight settled into its routine over the English Channel, Marcus finally succumbed to exhaustion. His chin dropped to his chest and his breathing became deep and regular. The passenger in the seat beside him, an elderly businessman named Robert Crawford, noticed the guard's peaceful expression and assumed he was simply resting his eyes. The irony of the situation was not lost on the universe. Here was a man whose entire career had been built on vigilance and protection, finally overcome by the most basic human need. The prince remained safe and secure, unaware that one of his guardians had entered the realm of dreams while soaring through the clouds at nearly 600 miles per hour. Captain Morrison continued his routine checks from the cockpit, occasionally scanning the instruments and communicating with air traffic control. The flight was proceeding exactly as planned, and there was no indication that within the next few hours, a simple case of fatigue would set in. Motion, a chain of events that would test everyone aboard this aircraft in ways they could never have imagined. The stage was set for what would become one of the most remarkable stories in aviation and royal protection history, all beginning with a dedicated guard's unavoidable surrender to exhaustion in row 12 of a routine flight to Dubai. Royal Guard story. Second part. 2 hours into the flight, the Boeing 777 was cruising smoothly over the Swiss Alps when the first indication of trouble emerged. Captain Morrison was reviewing weather updates when a yellow warning light appeared on his instrument panel. The light indicated a minor hydraulic pressure irregularity in the secondary system, nothing immediately dangerous but requiring attention according to standard operating procedures. First Officer. Chen was in the middle of calculating fuel consumption rates when Captain Morrison pointed out the warning. Both pilots had encountered similar situations before, and their training kicked in automatically. They began running through the appropriate checklist, cross-referencing the issue with their emergency procedures manual, while maintaining radio contact with European air traffic control. In row 12, Marcus Thompson continued sleeping peacefully, unaware of the developing situation. His fellow security team members remained alert at their positions, but none had yet noticed their colleague's unconscious state. The passenger seated next to Marcus, Robert Crawford, had assumed the guard was simply resting and had even admired what he perceived as the man's ability to relax during flight. The hydraulic issue proved more complex than initially anticipated. What had started as a minor pressure reading soon escalated when a second warning light illuminated, indicating that the primary hydraulic system was also experiencing problems. Captain Morrison felt his pulse quicken as he realized they were potentially facing a dual hydraulic failure, one of the most serious emergencies a commercial pilot could encounter. First Officer. Chen immediately contacted air traffic control to declare a precautionary emergency and request priority routing to the nearest suitable airport. The controller's voice crackled through their headsets, professional but concerned, as he began clearing other traffic from their path and preparing emergency services on the ground. The situation in the cockpit was becoming increasingly tense. Both pilots worked methodically through their emergency checklists, but the aircraft systems continued to degrade. The flight controls were becoming sluggish, and Captain Morrison had to apply increasing pressure to maintain their heading and altitude. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the cockpit. Prince Alexander, seated in first class, noticed the subtle change in the aircraft's movement, but attributed it to routine turbulence. He continued reviewing his diplomatic papers, occasionally glancing out the window at the snow-capped peaks below. His secretary Jennifer had fallen asleep with a tablet in her lap. Exhausted from the previous week's intensive preparations for the trade mission, Chief Inspector Wells, however, possessed the heightened situational awareness that came with years of security work. She sensed something different in the aircraft's behavior and noticed the increased activity of the flight attendants. Her training taught her to trust her instincts, and those instincts were telling her that something was not right. The cabin crew had been discreetly notified of the situation by Captain Morrison. Head flight attendant Patricia Kumar began conducting a subtle assessment of the cabin, checking for any passengers who might assist in an emergency while maintaining the calm atmosphere essential to preventing panic. Her experienced eyes swept over the passengers, noting their positions and potential reactions to various scenarios. As the hydraulic problems worsened, Captain Morrison made the difficult decision to begin descending toward Frankfurt Airport, one of Europe's best-equipped facilities for handling aircraft emergencies. The descent had to be carefully managed because normal flight controls were compromised, requiring both pilots to work together to maintain stability. The change in altitude awakened several passengers, including Robert Crawford, who noticed that the Royal Guard beside him was still sleeping, despite the aircraft's obvious change in behavior. Crawford found it remarkable that anyone could sleep so soundly during what felt like unusual flight conditions, though he had no idea of the true severity of the situation developing in the cockpit. Captain Morrison's hands gripped the controls tightly as he fought to maintain level flight. The aircraft wanted to bank to the right, requiring constant correction. First Officer Chen worked frantically with the backup systems, trying to restore normal hydraulic pressure, while communicating with both air traffic control and the airline's operations center. The emergency was becoming more serious by the minute. Without proper hydraulic pressure, the aircraft's primary flight controls were operating on backup systems with severely limited capability. Landing would require precise coordination and might involve emergency procedures that would test both pilots' skills to their absolute limits. Patricia Kumar received another update from the cockpit and began preparing her crew for a possible emergency landing. The process had to be conducted with utmost discretion to avoid alarming the passengers, but every flight attendant needed to understand their responsibilities if the situation deteriorated further. Chief Inspector Wells decided to conduct her own assessment of the cabin. As she moved through the aircraft, ostensibly stretching her legs, she mentally cataloged potential assets and liabilities among the passengers. Her route took her past row 12, where she was shocked to discover Royal Guard Marcus Thompson sleeping soundly in his seat. The discovery hit Wells like a physical blow. One of her team members was unconscious during what her instincts told her was developing into an emergency situation. Her first impulse was anger, but her professional training immediately took precedence. She needed to assess whether Marcus was ill, incapacitated, or simply sleeping before deciding on appropriate action. Wells quietly approached Marcus and observed his breathing and color. He appeared to be in normal sleep, not unconscious from illness or injury. She faced a dilemma: wake him immediately and potentially cause a scene that might alarm other passengers, or allow him to continue sleeping until the situation required his immediate attention. Before she could make that decision, Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that would change everything. His tone was calm, but carried an undercurrent of urgency that made every passenger pay attention. He explained that they were experiencing a minor technical issue and would be making a precautionary landing in Frankfurt, rather than continuing to Dubai. The announcement awakened Prince Alexander's protective instincts. As a member of the royal family, he had been trained to recognize potential security situations, and something in the captain's voice suggested this was more than a minor technical problem. He caught Jennifer's attention and quietly asked her to gather his essential documents in case they needed to depart the aircraft. Quickly, Robert Crawford finally realized that the sleeping guard beside him might not be exhibiting admirable relaxation, but rather a serious breach of duty. He gently tapped Marcus on the shoulder but received no response. The guard was deeply asleep, completely unaware that his charge might be in danger and that his fellow security officers were dealing with an escalating crisis. Chief Inspector Wells made her decision. She would allow Marcus to sleep for now, but would wake him immediately if the situation deteriorated further. However, she also began mentally reassigning security responsibilities to compensate for having one team member effectively out of action. The aircraft continued its descent toward Frankfurt, with Captain Morrison and First Officer Chen working together to maintain control. The backup systems were functioning, but everyone in the cockpit knew that the most dangerous part of the flight was still ahead of them. Landing a partially disabled aircraft would require skill, luck, and possibly divine intervention to accomplish safely. Royal Guard Story, third part. The descent toward Frankfurt International Airport became increasingly challenging as Captain Morrison fought against the aircraft's tendency to roll uncontrollably. The backup hydraulic systems were providing minimal assistance, forcing both pilots to use maximum physical strength to maintain even basic control. Sweat now poured down Morrison's face as he realized they were facing one of aviation's most dreaded scenarios. First Officer Chen was simultaneously managing radio communications with Frankfurt Tower, coordinating with the airline's emergency response team, and monitoring the aircraft's rapidly degrading systems. His voice remained steady and professional despite the growing severity of their situation, but his knuckles were white as he gripped his controls. The air traffic controller at Frankfurt had cleared all other aircraft from their approach path and alerted emergency services on the ground. Fire trucks, ambulances, and specialized aircraft rescue equipment were taking positions along the runway, their crews preparing for what could become a catastrophic accident or a miraculous safe landing. In the cabin, the tension was becoming palpable despite the crew's efforts to maintain normalcy. Experienced travelers could sense that something was seriously wrong from the aircraft's unusual movements and the subtle changes in engine sound. Flight attendant Patricia Kumar moved through the cabin with practiced calm, checking seatbelts and mentally preparing passengers for potential emergency procedures. Chief Inspector Wells had positioned herself where she could monitor both Prince Alexander and the sleeping Royal Guard Marcus Thompson. Her security training conflicted with her human instincts as she watched one of her team members remain unconscious during what was clearly becoming a life-threatening emergency. The irony was almost unbearable. The man whose job was to protect the prince was completely unaware that they might all be in mortal danger. Prince Alexander had noticed the increased activity of the flight, crew, and the subtle changes in other passengers' behavior. His diplomatic training had taught him to read situations and people, and every indicator suggested they were facing something far more serious than a routine technical problem. He quietly asked Jennifer to discreetly prepare for a possible emergency evacuation while maintaining the appearance of calm. The aircraft's control problems were worsening by the minute. Captain Morrison discovered that the rudder was becoming increasingly unresponsive, and the ailerons required enormous physical effort to move even slightly. The backup systems were failing one by one, leaving them with barely enough control authority to maintain level flight, much less execute a safe landing. Robert Crawford, the businessman seated next to the sleeping guard, was becoming increasingly agitated. He could clearly see that something was wrong with the flight, yet the man who appeared to be some sort of security officer remained deeply asleep. Crawford began to wonder if he should take it upon himself to wake the guard, but hesitated because he didn't want to interfere with what might be official procedures. Frankfurt Airport's emergency coordinator was coordinating the largest emergency response in the airport's recent history. Multiple fire companies, medical teams, and aircraft recovery specialists were positioning themselves for a potential disaster. The airport had been effectively closed to all other traffic, with arriving flights being diverted to alternate airports across Germany. Captain Morrison made a crucial decision that would determine whether they lived or died. With the aircraft becoming increasingly difficult to control, he realized that a conventional landing approach would be impossible. He would have to attempt a technique that few pilots had ever tried in a real emergency, using engine power alone to control their descent and landing. The technique, known as power-only flying, required using thrust from the engines to control pitch and direction, while using differential engine power to manage turns. It was extraordinarily difficult under the best circumstances and had never been attempted with a fully loaded commercial aircraft. Morrison had practiced it in simulators but never imagined he would need to use it to save 384 lives. First Officer Chen understood immediately what Morrison intended to do and began calculating the precise power settings they would need for each phase of the approach. The margin for error was virtually non-existent, and any mistake would likely result in a catastrophic crash. Their only advantage was that Frankfurt's runway was long enough to accommodate a higher than normal approach speed if necessary. As they descended through 15,000 feet, the aircraft's movements became even more erratic. Several passengers began to panic as the severity of the situation became undeniable. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, providing reassurance while discreetly preparing for emergency evacuation procedures. The professional calm they maintained was a testament to their training and dedication. Chief Inspector Wells finally made the decision to wake Royal Guard Marcus Thompson. The situation had deteriorated to the point where every security officer needed to be alert and ready for action. She approached his seat quietly and placed a firm hand on his shoulder, shaking him gently but insistently. Marcus awakened slowly, disoriented and confused by his surroundings. The deep sleep had left him groggy, and it took several seconds for him to remember where he was and what his responsibilities were. As consciousness returned, he immediately sensed the tension in the cabin and realized that something significant was happening. Wells quickly briefed Marcus on the developing emergency. Her voice low and urgent, she explained that they were facing a potential crash landing and that all security personnel needed to be prepared for evacuation and protection of the prince. Marcus felt a surge of shame and adrenaline as he realized he had been sleeping through what might be the most important moments of his career. The sleeping guard was finally awake, but the aircraft's problems were far from over. Captain Morrison was discovering that power-only flying was even more difficult than he had anticipated. The aircraft responded sluggishly to engine power changes, and maintaining a stable glide path required constant adjustment and incredible physical stamina. Prince Alexander observed the increased activity around him with the calm that came from years of public service and potential danger. He had been briefed on aircraft emergency procedures as part of his security training and understood the gravity of their situation. Despite the danger, his primary concern was for the safety of the other passengers and crew members. The Frankfurt Control Tower was coordinating with emergency services on the ground while providing Captain Morrison with wind conditions, runway information, and guidance for the unprecedented landing attempt. The controller's voice remained professional, but everyone listening could hear the underlying tension as they all realized they were witnessing either a miracle in the making or an impending tragedy. As they descended through 10,000 feet, the aircraft shuddered violently, and several passengers screamed. Captain Morrison fought to regain control, his muscles aching from the constant struggle against the damaged flight systems. The runway at Frankfurt was now visible in the distance, a thin strip of concrete that represented their only hope for survival. The most dangerous part of their ordeal was still ahead of them, and everyone aboard Flight BA447 was about to discover whether skill, determination, and luck would be enough to bring them safely back to Earth. Royal Guard story, fourth part at 8,000 feet above Frankfurt. Captain Morrison's worst fears were realized when the final backup hydraulic system began showing signs of failure. The aircraft was now essentially flying on borrowed time, with only engine power and the pilot's skill preventing an immediate catastrophe. First Officer Chen worked frantically with the emergency checklists, but they were rapidly running out of options and backup systems. The control tower at Frankfurt had cleared the airport of all personnel except essential emergency responders. Fire trucks lined the runway like mechanical sentinels, their crews standing ready with foam cannons and rescue equipment. The airport's medical facility had been placed on full alert, with additional ambulances streaming in from across the Frankfurt metropolitan area. In the cabin, Royal Guard Marcus Thompson was fully alert now, his professional instincts taking over despite the shame he felt about sleeping through the crisis. Chief Inspector Wells had positioned him to assist with Prince Alexander's protection during what was likely to be a rough landing or possible evacuation. The prince himself remained remarkably calm, reviewing emergency procedures with his secretary Jennifer, while preparing for whatever might come next. Patricia Kumar, the head flight attendant, received word from the cockpit that they were beginning their final approach. She immediately initiated the emergency landing preparation sequence, instructing passengers to assume the brace position, while her crew secured the cabin for impact. Her voice over the intercom was steady and reassuring, giving no hint of the terror she felt about their chances of survival. Captain Morrison began the most challenging flying of his career as he started the power-only approach to runway 25L. Without proper flight controls, he had to use tiny adjustments in engine thrust to control their descent rate and direction. The technique required incredible precision and physical stamina, as even the smallest error could send them into an uncontrollable spin or stall. The aircraft descended through 6,000 feet with Frankfurt's landscape spreading out below them. From the cockpit windows, Morrison could see the emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, and knew that hundreds of people on the ground were watching their approach, probably wondering if they were about to witness a miracle or a disaster. First Officer Chen was calling out altitude, airspeed, and descent rate while managing communications with the tower. His calm professionalism was a crucial support for Morrison, who needed to focus entirely on the nearly impossible task of controlling the aircraft with engine power alone. Every few seconds, Chen would make slight adjustments to help maintain their precarious stability. At 4,000 feet, the aircraft encountered a crosswind that nearly sent them into a fatal spin. Morrison had to make rapid power adjustments to counter the wind's effect, and for several terrifying moments, the aircraft rolled dangerously to the left before he managed to level it out. Several passengers screamed, and the sound of someone becoming violently ill could be heard from the rear of the cabin. Prince Alexander felt the aircraft's violent movement, but maintained his composure, even placing a reassuring hand on Jennifer's arm as she gripped her armrest in terror. His security detail was positioned throughout the cabin, all now fully alert and prepared for emergency evacuation procedures. Marcus Thompson had redeemed himself by taking charge of passenger assistance in his section, helping elderly travelers prepare for the potential impact. The Frankfurt emergency coordinator was providing continuous updates to Captain Morrison about wind conditions, runway status, and the position of emergency equipment. The runway had been treated with foam to reduce fire risk in case of a crash landing, and specialized aircraft recovery equipment was standing by to assist with evacuation if they survived the landing. At 2,000 feet, Morrison realized they were approaching too fast and would overshoot the runway if he didn't find a way to slow down. Without normal flight controls, his options were extremely limited. He made the dangerous decision to reduce engine power more dramatically, accepting the increased risk of stalling in exchange for a better chance of hitting the runway. The gamble nearly cost them everything. As the engine spooled down, the aircraft's nose dropped suddenly and they began descending much faster than safe. Several passengers who weren't properly braced were thrown against their seatbelts, and the sound of breaking glass came from the galley area where loose items had become projectiles. Chen called out warnings about their rapid descent rate, while Morrison fought to regain control. The ground was rushing up toward them at an alarming rate, and for a moment it seemed certain they would crash short of the runway. Morrison pushed the engines back to higher power and slowly, agonizingly, their descent rate decreased to something closer to survivable. At 1,000 feet, they were lined up with the runway but still approaching too fast. The emergency vehicles on the ground were tracking their approach, ready to race to their assistance the moment they touched down. Airport fire crews had never seen an approach like this one, with an aircraft essentially gliding toward the runway with minimal control authority. Chief Inspector Wells was coordinating with her security team through hand signals, preparing for rapid evacuation if they survived the landing. She had positioned herself where she could reach Prince Alexander quickly, while ensuring that all her officers knew their responsibilities. The shame of Marcus Thompson's earlier lapse was forgotten now, as he proved his worth by assisting other passengers and maintaining security protocols, even in the face of potential death. Robert Crawford, the businessman who had sat next to the sleeping guard, was now fully aware of how serious their situation was. He found himself oddly comforted by the fact that the guard was now alert and professional, even though he realized this meant their situation was probably worse than he had imagined. At 500 feet, Morrison could see individual emergency responders on the ground, their faces turned upward as they watched the crippled aircraft's approach. The runway threshold markers were directly ahead, but they were still moving too fast for a normal landing. He would have to attempt a technique that was part flying skill and part controlled crash. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold at nearly 200 miles per hour, far faster than the normal landing speed of about 150 mph. Morrison had one chance to get this right, and the lives of 384 people depended on his ability to execute a landing that no pilot had ever successfully accomplished. With a fully loaded commercial aircraft, the main landing gear touched the runway with tremendous force, sending shockwaves through the aircraft's structure. The impact was so violent that overhead bins opened and loose items flew through the cabin like missiles. Several passengers screamed in terror as they realized they were now in a race between friction and physics to determine whether they would stop before running out of runway. The next few seconds would determine whether this would be recorded as one of aviation's greatest saves or its most tragic disasters. Royal Guard story. Fifth part. The Boeing 777 screamed down Frankfurt's runway at nearly 200 miles per hour, its tires smoking and screeching as Captain Morrison deployed every available method to slow their speed. The thrust reversers engaged with a thunderous roar, but without proper brake authority due to the hydraulic failures, stopping the massive aircraft seemed impossible within the remaining runway distance. First Officer Chen was calling out their speed every few seconds while monitoring the aircraft systems for any sign of fire or structural failure. The violent touchdown had stressed every component of the aircraft beyond normal limits, and warning lights were illuminating across the cockpit panel like a deadly Christmas tree. Yet somehow the engines continued running, and the landing gear held firm against forces they were never designed to withstand. In the cabin, passengers were thrown forward against their seatbelts as the deceleration forces built up. The sound was deafening, screeching tires, roaring engines in reverse thrust, and the groaning of metal under extreme stress. Flight attendant Patricia Kumar was shouting instructions for passengers to remain seated and braced, though her voice could barely be heard above the mechanical chaos. Royal Guard. Marcus Thompson had positioned himself to shield other passengers from flying debris, while maintaining visual contact with Prince Alexander. His earlier shame at sleeping through the emergency had transformed into fierce determination to prove his worth during these crucial moments. He could see Chief Inspector Wells near the Prince, her body tensed and ready for immediate action if evacuation became necessary. The emergency vehicles on the ground were racing alongside the aircraft, matching its speed as it decelerated. Fire truck crews could see sparks flying from the wheels and were prepared to deploy foam the instant the aircraft came to a stop. The sight of the massive aircraft careening down the runway at such high speed was both terrifying and mesmerizing to the emergency responders. At the halfway point of the runway, they were still traveling over 120 miles per hour, with less than 6,000 feet of concrete remaining. Captain Morrison made a decision that violated every safety protocol but might save their lives. He began steering the aircraft slightly off the runway centerline toward the grass-overrun area, gambling that the softer surface would help slow them down, even if it risked a catastrophic rollover. The aircraft's right main gear left the concrete and hit the grass with a tremendous thump that shook every rivet in the fuselage. Mud and debris flew up around the windows as the right side of the aircraft began to slow more rapidly than the left side. Morrison fought to keep them from spinning out of control, using differential engine power and whatever control authority remained to maintain directional stability. Prince Alexander felt the aircraft's violent shaking and instinctively braced himself for what might be their final moments. Despite his royal training in maintaining composure under pressure, he found himself thinking about his family and the responsibilities he would never fulfill if they didn't survive the next few seconds. His secretary Jennifer was gripping his hand with surprising strength, her usual professional demeanor replaced by raw human fear. The grass overrun was doing its job, creating additional drag that helped slow the aircraft. But they were rapidly approaching the airport perimeter fence. Beyond that fence lay a major highway with afternoon traffic, and Morrison realized they might survive the landing only to cause a catastrophe on the ground. He had to find a way to stop before they became a missile launched into civilian population. With less than 1,000 feet before the fence, Morrison made his final desperate gambit. He shut down both engines completely and deployed the emergency ground spoilers, devices designed to destroy lift and increase drag. The sudden loss of engine power and deployment of the spoilers created a dramatic increase in stopping force, but also made the aircraft much less stable. The Boeing 777 began to slide sideways as it decelerated, its nose swinging toward the left while the tail moved right. For terrifying moments, it seemed certain they would flip over or break apart from the tremendous side loads. Passengers screamed as they felt the aircraft sliding out of control. But somehow the landing gear held and the fuselage remained intact. Chief Inspector Wells was thrown against her seatbelt so hard she could barely breathe. But she maintained visual contact with Prince Alexander and her team members. Royal Guard Marcus Thompson was helping an elderly passenger who had been injured by falling luggage, demonstrating the dedication that had made him part of the royal security detail despite his earlier lapse. The emergency responders on the ground watched in amazement as the aircraft continued its sideways slide across the grass, throwing up clouds of dirt and debris but somehow remaining upright. Fire trucks were positioning themselves for immediate response, their crews knowing that they had only seconds to reach the aircraft if fire broke out. Robert Crawford, the businessman who had witnessed the guards sleeping earlier, was now experiencing a mixture of terror and admiration for the crew's performance. He could see that everyone around him was fighting to maintain control and help others, and he understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, either a miracle or the last moments of 384 lives. The aircraft's sliding motion was gradually decreasing as friction with the grass, and dirt continued to absorb their remaining energy. They were now less than 500 feet from the perimeter fence, and it was becoming clear that they might actually stop in time. The emergency vehicles were closing in from all directions, ready to surround the aircraft the instant it came to rest. Captain Morrison felt the aircraft's motion finally stabilizing as their ground speed dropped below 50 miles per hour. The engines were silent. The thrust reversers had done their work, and the grass overrun had provided the additional stopping power they needed. For the first time since the emergency began, he allowed himself to believe they might actually survive. At 30 miles per hour, the aircraft was still moving, but clearly going to stop well short of the fence. Emergency responders were already deploying foam around the landing gear and engines, preparing for immediate evacuation procedures. The airport fire chief was coordinating multiple teams to ensure rapid passenger evacuation and medical care for any injuries. As the Boeing 777 finally shuddered to a complete stop in Frankfurt's grass overrun area, 384 people sat in stunned silence for a moment before the reality of their survival began to sink in. They had just experienced one of the most remarkable emergency landings in aviation history, saved by exceptional piloting skill, professional crew work, and perhaps a measure of divine intervention, but their ordeal was far from over. Now came the equally dangerous task of evacuating nearly 400 people from a damaged aircraft that might catch fire at any moment, all while ensuring that Prince Alexander and his security detail could maintain their protection protocols even in the chaos of an emergency evacuation. Royal Guard Story. Final part. The silence inside the Boeing 777 lasted only seconds before Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom with the words everyone desperately needed to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are safely on the ground. Please remain seated while the cabin crew prepares for evacuation." His voice was hoarse from the stress and physical exertion of the landing, but it carried the authority and calm that passengers needed in that moment. Flight attendant Patricia Kumar immediately initiated evacuation procedures, while emergency responders surrounded the aircraft outside. Foam was being sprayed on the engines and landing gear as a precaution against fire, and specialized teams were positioning evacuation slides at multiple exits. The sight of so many emergency vehicles around them was both reassuring and terrifying to the passengers who could see out the windows. Chief Inspector Wells sprang into action with the precision that had made her one of Britain's top security officers. She quickly coordinated with her team to establish a protective perimeter around Prince Alexander, while ensuring they didn't interfere with the emergency evacuation procedures. The challenge was enormous. Maintain royal security protocols while allowing emergency responders to do their job in what was still a potentially dangerous situation. Royal Guard Marcus Thompson had transformed from the embarrassed officer who had slept through the crisis into a model of professional efficiency. He was assisting elderly passengers toward the emergency exits while maintaining constant awareness of Prince Alexander's location and security needs. The shame of his earlier failure had been replaced by fierce determination to prove his worth. When it mattered most, Prince Alexander himself demonstrated the leadership qualities that had made him a respected member of the royal family. Rather than demanding special treatment or priority evacuation, he insisted on helping other passengers and ensuring that children and elderly travelers were evacuated first. His calm demeanor and visible concern for others helped prevent panic in a situation that could have easily descended into chaos. The evacuation slides were deployed and inflated within minutes of the aircraft coming to rest. German emergency responders worked with military precision, guiding passengers down the slides and immediately away from the aircraft to a safe assembly area. Medical teams were standing by to treat injuries, though remarkably, most passengers had escaped serious harm despite the violent landing. Robert Crawford, The businessman who had witnessed the entire drama from his seat next to the sleeping guard found himself oddly moved by the transformation he had observed. The same officer who had been unconscious during the crisis was now helping others with quiet efficiency, proving that human beings could rise above their failures when circumstances demanded their best. Captain Morrison and First Officer Chen remained in the cockpit until every passenger had been evacuated, following standard procedures despite their exhaustion and the trauma they had just experienced. When they finally emerged from the aircraft, they were greeted by thunderous applause from the emergency responders who had witnessed their extraordinary flying skills. The landing would later be studied in aviation schools around the world as an example of how training, skill, and determination could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. The Frankfurt Airport fire chief conducted a thorough inspection of the aircraft and declared it safe from fire risk. Though the damage from the emergency landing was extensive, the Boeing 777 would never fly again, but it had served its ultimate purpose by bringing all 384 souls aboard safely back to Earth. The insurance companies would later declare it a total loss, but no monetary value could be placed on the lives that had been saved. In the terminal building where passengers were being processed and receiving medical attention, Prince Alexander personally thanked every member of the flight crew and security team. When he reached Marcus Thompson, the guard expected censure for his failure to remain alert during the crisis. Instead, the prince commended him for his assistance during the evacuation and his professionalism under pressure. Chief Inspector Wells filed her report on the incident with characteristic honesty and attention to detail. She noted Marcus Thompson's initial failure to maintain alertness but also documented his exceptional performance during the evacuation and his assistance to other passengers. Her recommendation was that he receive additional training rather than disciplinary action, recognizing that his failure stemmed from personal circumstances rather than professional inadequacy. The media coverage of the emergency landing focused primarily on the exceptional flying skills of Captain Morrison and First Officer Chen, but the story of the sleeping Royal Guard became a human interest element that captured public attention. Rather than destroying his career, the incident became a teaching moment about the importance of recognizing human limitations and supporting colleagues during difficult personal times. Marcus Thompson learned valuable lessons about the importance of seeking help when personal circumstances affected his professional performance. The birth of his daughter and his wife's medical complications had created stress that he should have reported to his supervisors rather than trying to handle alone. The Royal Protection Service implemented new policies to better support officers dealing with family emergencies. 6 months later, Flight BA 447's crew was awarded multiple honors for their performance during the emergency. Captain Morrison received the Distinguished Flying Cross, while the entire crew was recognized by the International Air Transport Association for their exceptional professionalism. The incident became a case study in crisis management and emergency response procedures. Prince Alexander's diplomatic mission to Dubai was rescheduled and eventually completed successfully. The trade agreements negotiated during that visit would later be credited with strengthening relationships between Britain and the United Arab Emirates. The prince often reflected on how the emergency landing had reminded him of the fragility of life and the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. The Boeing 777 remained at Frankfurt Airport for several months while investigators studied every aspect of the incident. The hydraulic failure was eventually traced to a manufacturing defect that led to worldwide inspections of similar aircraft and improved safety procedures. The investigation praised both the crew's performance and the effectiveness of emergency response protocols. Marcus Thompson continued his career with the Royal Protection Service, eventually becoming a training instructor who specialized in preparing officers for crisis situations. He often told new recruits about the importance of maintaining alertness while also recognizing their human limitations. His story became part of the service's training curriculum as an example of how professionals could learn and grow from their mistakes. The incident at Frankfurt Airport became known in aviation circles as the miracle of Row 12, not just for the extraordinary landing but for the human drama that unfolded during those terrifying hours. It demonstrated how ordinary people could perform extraordinary acts when faced with life-threatening circumstances, and how redemption was possible even after significant failure. Years later, when Marcus Thompson retired from the Royal Protection Service, Prince Alexander personally attended his retirement ceremony. In his speech, the prince noted that the emergency landing had taught him that true character was revealed not by never making mistakes, but by how individuals responded when their mistakes were discovered and lives hung in the balance. The story served as a reminder that even in our most professional moments, we remain fundamentally human, subject to fatigue, stress, and the basic needs that affect all people. It also demonstrated that exceptional circumstances could bring out the best in individuals who might otherwise seem ordinary, and that redemption was always possible for those willing to learn from their failures and commit to doing better.